Joseph Stalin was a Georgian-born Soviet revolutionary and political leader who led the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953. He held power as a General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1952 and Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1953, initially governing the country as a part of a collective leadership. He consolidated power to become dictator by the 1930s, ideologically adhering to the Leninist interpretation of Marxism. He formalized these ideas as Marxism-Leninism, while his own policies are called Stalinism. Born to a poor family in Gori in the Russian Empire, now Georgia, Stalin attended the Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary before joining the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. He edited the party's protection rackets, repeatedly arrested. He underwent several internal exiles to Siberia. After the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution and created one-party state under the New Communism Party in 1917, Stalin joined its governing Politburo, serving in the Russian Civil War before overseeing the Soviet Union's establishment in 1922. Stalin assumed leadership over the country following Lenin's death in 1924. Under Stalin, socialism in one country became a central tenet of the party's ideology. As a result of his 5-year plans, the country underwent agricultural collectivization and rapid industrialization, creating a centralized command economy. Severe disruptions to food production contributed to the famine of 1930 to 1933 that killed millions. To eradicate accused enemies of working class, Stalin instituted the Great Purge, in which over 1 million were imprisoned, largely in the Gulag system of forced labor camps, and at least 700,000 executed between 1934 and 1939. By 1937, he had absolute control over the party and the government. Stalin promoted Marxism and Leninism abroad through the Communist International and supported European anti-fascist movements during the 1930s, particularly in the Spanish Civil War. In 1939, his regime signed a pact by invading the Soviet Union in 1941. His regime signed an aggression pact with Nazi Germany, resulting in the Soviet invasion of Poland. Germany ended the pact by invading the Soviet Union in 1941. Despite the initial catastrophes, the Soviet Red Army repelled the German invasion and captured Berlin in 1945. Ending World War II in Europe, amid the war, the Soviets annexed the Baltic states and Bessarabia and North Bukovina, subsequently establishing Soviet-aligned governments throughout Central and Eastern Europe and in parts of East Asia. The Soviet Union and the United States merged as global superpowers and entered a period of tension. The Cold War. Stalin presided over the Soviet post-war reconstruction and its development of an atomic bomb in 1949. During these years, the country experienced another major famine and an anti-Semitic campaign that culminated in the Doctor's Plot. After Stalin's death in 1953, he was eventually succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev, who subsequently denounced his rule and initiated the de-Stalinization of Soviet society. Widely considered to be one of the 20th century's most significant figures, Stalin was a subject of a pervasive personality cult with the international Marxist-Leninist movement, which revered him as a champion of the working class and socialism. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Stalin has retained popularity in Russia and Georgia as a victorious wartime leader who cemented the Soviet Union's status as a leading world power. Conversely, his regime had been described as totalitarian and has been widely condemned for overseeing mass repression, ethnic cleansing, wide-scale deportation, hundreds of thousands of executions, and famines that killed millions. Stalin was born in Georgian town of Gori, then part of Tiflis Governorate of the Russian Empire and home to a mix of Georgian, Azeri, Armenian, Russian, and Jewish communities. He was born on 18 December 1878 and birthplace on 29 December. His birth name was Loseb Bessaronius Ze Jugulavishvili, and he was nicknamed Soso, a diminutive of Loseb. His parents were Bessoron Jugovili and Ekaterine Geladze. He was their only child to survive past infancy. In October 1899, Stalin began to work as a meteorologist at the Tbilisi Observatory. He had a light workload and therefore had plenty of time for revolutionary activity. He attracted a group of supporters through his classes in social theory and co-organized a secret workers' mass meeting for May Day May Day 1900, at which he successfully encouraged many of the men to take strike action. By this point, the Empire's secret police, the Okhrana, were aware of Stalin's activities in Tiflis revolutionary milieu. They attempted to arrest him in March 1901, but he escaped and went into hiding, living off the donations of friends and sympathizers. Remaining underground, he helped plan a demonstration for May Day 1901 in which 3,000 marchers clashed with the authorities. He continued to evade arrest by using aliases and sleeping in different apartments. In November 1901, he was elected to Tbilisi community of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, a Marxist party founded in 1898. That month, Stalin traveled to the port city of Batum. His militant rhetoric proved divisive among city Marxists, some of whom suspected that he might be an agent provocateur working for the government. In January 1905, government troops massacred protesters in St. Petersburg. Unrest soon spread across the Russian Empire in what came to be known as the Revolution of 1905. Georgia was particularly affected. Stalin was in Baku in February when ethnic violence broke out between Armenians and Azeris. At least 2,000 were killed. He publicly lambasted the pogroms against Jews and Armenians as being part of the Tsar Nicholas II's attempts to buttress his despicable throne. Stalin formed a Bolshevik battle squad which he used to try to keep Baku's warring ethnic factions apart. He also used the unrest as a cover for stealing printing equipment. Amid growing violence throughout Georgia, he formed further battle squads with the Mensheviks doing the same. In January 1912, while Stalin was in exile, the first Bolshevik Central Committee was elected at the Prague Conference. Shortly after the conference, Lenin and Grigory Zinolev decided to co-opt Stalin to the committee. Still in Vologda, Stalin agreed remaining a Central Committee member for the rest of his life. Lenin believed that Stalin as a Georgian would help secure support for the Bolsheviks from the empire's minority ethnicities. In February 1912, Stalin again escaped to St. Petersburg, tasked with converting the Bolshevik weekly newspaper Zvezda Star into a daily. Truth. The new newspaper was launched in April 1912, although Stalin's role as an editor was kept secret. While Stalin was in exile, Russia entered the First World War, and in October 1916, Stalin and other exiled Bolsheviks were conscripted into the Russian army, leaving for Monashtikoy. They arrived in Krasnoyarsk in February 1917, where a medical examiner ruled Stalin unfit for military service because of his crippled arm. Stalin was required to serve 4 more months of his exile, and he successfully requested that he serve it nearby Achinsk. Stalin was in the city when the February Revolution took place. Uprisings broke out in Petrograd as St. Petersburg had been renamed, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated to escape being violently overthrown. The Russian Empire became a de facto republic headed by a provisional government dominated by liberals. In a celebratory mood, Stalin traveled by train to Petrograd in March. There, Stalin and fellow Bolshevik Lev Kamenev assumed control of Pravda, and Stalin was appointed the Bolshevik representative to the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet, an influential council of the city workers. In April, Stalin came third in the Bolshevik elections for the party's central committee. Lenin came first and Zinoviev came second. This reflected his senior standing in the party at the time. On October 26, 1917, Lenin declared himself chairman of the new government, the Council of People's Commissars. Stalin backed Lenin's decision not to form a coalition with the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionary Party. Although they did not form a coalition government with the left Socialist Revolutionists, Stalin became part of an informal foursome leading the government alongside Lenin, Trotsky, and Zhedov. Of this, Zhedov was regularly absent and died in March 1919. Stalin's office was based near to Lenin's in the Solny Institute, and he and Trotsky were the only individuals allowed to access to Lenin's study without an appointment. Although not so publicly well known as Lenin or Trotsky, Stalin's importance among the Bolsheviks grew. He consigned Lenin's decrees shutting down the hostile newspapers, and along with Zhedov, he chaired the sessions of the committee drafting a constitution for the new Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. He strongly supported Lenin's formation of the Cheka Security Service and the subsequent Red Terror that he initiated, noting that state violence had proven an effective tool for the capitalist powers. He believed that it would have proved the same for the Soviet government, unlike the senior Bolsheviks like Kamenev and Nikolai Bukharin. Stalin never expressed concern about the rapid growth of the expansion of the Cheka and the Red Terror. After the Bolsheviks seized power, both right and left-wing armies rallied against them, generating the Russian Civil War. To secure access to the dwindling food supply in May 1918, Sovnarkom sent Stalin to Tsaritsyn to take charge of food procurement in southern Russia. Eager to prove himself as a commander, once there he took control of the regional military operations. He befriended two military figures, Clement Voroshilov and Semyon Budinyon. He would form the nucleus of his military and political support base. Believing that the victory was assured by numerical superiority, he sent large numbers of Red Army troops into battle against the region's anti-Bolshevik White armies, resulting in heavy losses. Lenin was concerned by this costly tactic. In Tsaritsyn, Stalin commanded the local Cheka branch to execute suspected counter-revolutionaries, sometimes without trial, and in contravention of government orders, purged the military and food collection agencies of middle-class specialists, some of whom he also executed. His use of state violence and terror was a greater scale than most Bolshevik leaders approved of. For instance, he ordered several villages to be torched to ensure compliance with his food procurement program. The Soviet government sought to bring neighboring states under its domination. In February 1921, it invaded the Menshevik-governed Georgia, while in April 1921, Stalin ordered the Red Army to Turkestan to reassert Russian state control. As People's Commissar for Nationality, Stalin believed that each national and ethnic group should have the right to self-expression, facilitated two autonomous republics within the Russian state in which they could oversee various regional affairs. In taking this view, the Marxists accused him of bending too much to bogus nationalism, while others accused him of remaining too Russocentric by seeking to retain these nations within the Russian state. Lenin died in January 1924. Stalin took charge of the funeral and was one of his pallbearers against the wishes of Lenin's widow. The Politburo embalmed his corpse and placed it within a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. It was incorporated into a growing personality cult devoted to Lenin, with Petrograd being renamed Leningrad that year. To bolster his image as the devoted Leninist, Stalin gave 9 lectures at Sedlov University on the foundations of Leninism, later published in book form. During the 13th Party Congress in May 1924, Lenin's testament was read only to the leaders of the provincial delegations. Embarrassed by its contents, Stalin offered his resignation as general secretary. This act of humility saved him, and he was retained in the position. The Soviet Union lagged behind the industrial development of Western countries, and there had been a shortfall of grain. 1927 produced only 70% of grain produced in 1926. Stalin's government feared attack from Japan, France, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Romania. Many communists, including the Komsomol, OGPU, and the Red Army, were eager to be rid of the NEP and its market-oriented approach. They had concerns about those who profited from their policy, affluent peasants known as kulaks and small business owners or NEP-men. At this point, Stalin turned against the NEP, which put him on course to the left even of Trotsky or Zinoviev. In 1928, Stalin declared that class war between the proletariat and the enemies would intensify as socialism developed. He warned of a danger from the right, including the Communist Party itself. The first major show trial in USSR was the Shakti trial of 1928, in which several middle-class industrial specialists were convicted of sabotage. From 1929 to 1930, further show trials were held to intimidate opposition. This included the Industrial Party trial, Menshevik trial, and Metrovika's trial. Aware that the ethnic Russian majority may have concerns about being ruled by a Georgian, he promoted ethnic Russians throughout the state hierarchy and made the Russian language compulsory throughout schools and offices, albeit to be used in tandem with local languages in areas with non-Russian majorities. Nationalist sentiment among ethnic minorities was suppressed. Conservative social policies were promoted to enhance social discipline and boost population growth. This included a focus on strong family units and motherhood, recriminalization of homosexuality, restrictions placed on abortion and divorce, and abolition of xenotodle women's department. Within the Soviet Union, there was widespread civic disgruntlement against Stalin's government. Social unrest, previously restricted largely to the countryside, was increasingly evident in urban areas, prompting Stalin to ease on some of his economic policies in 1932. In May 1932, he introduced a system of kolkhoz markets where peasants could trade their surplus produce. At the same time, penal sanctions became more severe. At Stalin's instigation in August 1932, a decree was introduced wherein the theft of of even a handful of grain could be capital offense. The second 5-year plan added production quotas reduced from that of the first, with the main emphasis now being on improving living conditions. It therefore emphasized the expansion of housing space and the production of consumer goods. Like its predecessor, this plan was repeatedly amended to meet changing situation. There was, for instance, an increase in emphasis placed on armament production after Adolf Hitler became German Chancellor in 1933. In 1935 to 36, Stalin oversaw a new constitution. Its dramatic liberal features was designed as propaganda weapons for all power rested in the hands of Stalin and his Politburo. He declared that socialism, which is the first phase of communism, has basically been achieved in this country. In 1938, the story of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, colloquially known as the Short Course, was released. Biographer Robert Conquest later referred to it as the central text of Stalinism. A number of authorized Stalin biographies were also published. Although Stalin generally wanted to be portrayed as the embodiment of the Communist Party rather than have his life story explored, during the later 1930s, Stalin placed a few limits on the worship of his own greatness. By 1938, Stalin's inner circle had gained a degree of stability containing the personalities who would remain there until Stalin's death. Stalin often gave conflicting signals regarding state repression. In May 1933, he released from prison many convicted of minor offenses, ordering the security services not to enact further mass arrests and deportations. In September 1934, he launched a commission to investigate false imprisonment. That same month, he called for the execution of workers at the Stalin metallurgical factory accused of spying for Japan. The mixed approach began to change in December 1934. After prominent party member Sergei Kirov was murdered. After the murder, Stalin became increasingly concerned by the threat of assassination, improving his personal security, and rarely went out in public. State repression intensified after Kirov's death. Stalin instigated this, reflecting his prioritization of security above other considerations. Stalin issued a decree establishing an NKVD Troikas, which could mete out rulings without involving the courts. In 1935, he ordered the NKVD to expel suspected counter-revolutionaries from urban areas. In early 1935, over 11,000 were expelled from Leningrad. 1936, Nikolai Yezhov became head of NKVD. As a Marxist-Leninist, Stalin considered conflict between competing capitalist powers inevitable. After Nazi Germany annexed Austria and then part of Czechoslovakia in 1938, he recognized a war was looming. He sought to maintain Soviet neutrality, hoping that a German war against France and Britain would lead to Soviet dominance in Europe. Militarily, the Soviets also faced a threat from the east, with Soviet troops clashing with the expansionist Japanese. In the latter part of the 1930s, Stalin initiated a military build-up with the Red Army, more than doubting between January 1939 and June 1941. Although in its haste to expand, many of its officers were poorly trained. Between 1940 and 1941, he also purged the military, leaving it with severe shortage of trained officers when war broke out. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, initiating the war on the Eastern Front. Despite intelligence agencies repeatedly warning him of German intentions, Stalin was taken by surprise. He formed a State Defense Committee, which he headed as a supreme commander, as well as a military supreme command, with Georgy Zhukov as his chief of staff. The German tactic of Blitzkrieg was initially highly effective. The Soviet Air Force in the western borderlands was destroyed within 2 days. The German Wehrmacht pushed deep into the Soviet territory. Soon, Ukraine, Belarusia, and the Baltic states were under German occupation, and Leningrad was under siege, and Soviet refugees were flooding into Moscow and surrounding cities. By July, Germany's Luftwaffe was bombing Moscow, and by October, the Wehrmacht was amassing a full assault on the capital. Plans were made for the Soviet government to evacuate to Kulbyshev, although Stalin decided to remain in Moscow, believing his flight would damage troop morale. German advance on Moscow was halted after 2 months of battle in increasingly harsh weather conditions. By November 1942, the Soviets had begun to repulse the important German strategic Saturn campaign. Although there were 2.5 million Soviet casualties in that effort, it permitted the Soviets to take the offensive for the most of the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. Germany attempted the encirclement attack at Kursk, which was successfully repulsed by the Soviets. By the end of 1943, the Soviets occupied The Soviets occupied half of the territory taken by the Germans from 1941 to 1942. Soviet military-industrial output had also increased substantially from late 1941 to early 1943 after Stalin had moved factories well to the east of the front, safe from the German invasion and the aerial assault. In April 1945, the Red Army seized Berlin under after Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered in May. Stalin had wanted Hitler captured alive, yet his remains brought to Moscow to prevent them becoming a relic for Nazi sympathizers. As the Red Army had conquered German territory, they discovered the extermination camps that the Nazi administration had run. Many Soviet soldiers engaged in looting, pillaging and rape, both in Germany and parts of Eastern Europe. Stalin refused to punish the offenders. After receiving a complaint about this from Yugoslav communist Milan Djilic, Stalin asked how, after experiencing the traumas of a war, a soldier could react normally, and what he saw awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors. After the war, Stalin was, according to service, at the apex of his career. Within the Soviet Union, he was widely regarded as the embodiment of the victory and patriotism. His armies controlled Central and Eastern Europe up to the river Elbe. In June 1945, Stalin adopted the title of Generalissimus and stood atop of Lenin's mausoleum to watch a celebratory parade led by Zhukov through Red Square. At the banquet held for army commanders, he described the Russian people as the outstanding nation and leading force within the Soviet Union. The first time that he had unequivocally endorsed the Russians over other Soviet nationalities. In 1946, the state published Stalin's collected works. In 1947, it brought out a second edition of his official biography, which eulogized him to a greater extent than its predecessor. He was quoted in bravado on a daily basis, and pictures of him remained pervasive on the walls of workplaces and homes. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire declined, leaving the US and USSR as the dominant world powers. Tensions among these former allies grew, resulting in the Cold War. Although Stalin publicly described the British and US governments as aggressive, he thought it unlikely that a war with them would be imminent, believing that several decades of peace was likely. He nevertheless secretly intensified Soviet research into nuclear weaponry, intent on creating an atomic bomb. Still, Stalin foresaw the undesirability of a nuclear conflict, saying in 1949 that atomic weapons can hardly be used without spelling the end of the world. He personally took a keen interest in the development of the weapon. In August 1949, the bomb was successfully tested in the deserts outside St. Petersburg in Kazakhstan. Stalin also initiated a new military build-up. The Soviet army was expanded from 2.9 million soldiers as it stood in 1949 to 5.8 million by 1953. After the war, Stalin sought to retain Soviet dominance across Eastern Europe while expanding its influence in Asia. Cautiously regarding the responses from the Western allies, Stalin avoided immediately installing Communist Party governments across Eastern Europe, instead initially ensuring that Marxist-Leninists were placed in coalition ministries. In contrast to his approach to the Baltic states, he rejected the proposal of merging the new communist states in the Soviet Union. Rather than recognizing them as independent nation-states, he was faced with the problem that there were few Marxists left in the Eastern Europe, and in Eastern Europe. He demanded that war reparations be paid by Germany and its Axis allies Hungary, Romania, and Slovak Republic. Aware that these countries had been pushed toward socialism through invasion rather than by proletarian revolution, Stalin referred to them not as dictatorship of the proletariat but as people's democracies, just suggesting that in these countries there was pro-socialist alliance combining the proletariat, peasantry, and lower middle class. In October 1949, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong took power in China. With these accomplished Marxist governments now controlled a third of the world's landmass. Privately, Stalin revealed that he had underestimated the Chinese Communists and their ability to win the civil war, instead encouraging them to make another peace with the KMT. In December 1949, Mao visited Stalin. Initially, Stalin refused to repeal the Sino-Soviet Treaty of 1945, which significantly benefited the Soviet Union over China. Although in January 1950, he relented and agreed to sign a new treaty between the two countries. Stalin was concerned that Mao might follow Tito's example by pursuing a course independent of the Soviet influence, and made it known that if displeased, he would withdraw assistance from China. The Chinese desperately needed the said assistance after decades of civil war. In his later years, Stalin was poor in health. He took increasingly long holidays in 1950s and again in 1951. He spent almost 5 months on holiday at his Abkhazian dacha. Stalin nevertheless mistrusted his doctors. In January 1952, he had one imprisoned after they suggested that he should try to improve his health. In September 1952, several Kremlin doctors were arrested for allegedly plotting to kill senior politicians in what came to be known as the doctors' plot. The majority of the accused were Jewish. He instructed the arrested doctors to be tortured to ensure confession. In November, the Slansky trial took place in Czechoslovakia as 13 senior Communist Party figures, 11 of them Jewish, were accused and convicted of being part of a vast Zionist American conspiracy to subvert Eastern Bloc governments. That same month, a much publicized trial of accused Jewish industrial wreckers took place in Ukraine. In 1951, initiated the Mingrelian Affair, a purge of the Georgian branch of the Communist Party, which resulted in over 11,000 deportations. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin's staff found him semi-unconscious on the bedroom floor of his Kuntsevo dacha. He had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. He was moved onto a couch and remained there for 3 days. He was fed using a spoon, given various medicines and injections, and leeches were applied to him. Sevtana and Vasily were called to the dacha on March 2nd. The latter were drunk and angrily shouted at the doctors, as a result of which he was sent home. Stalin died on 5th March 1953. According to Levitan, it had been a difficult and terrible death. An autopsy revealed that he had died of cerebral hemorrhage and also that his cerebral arteries were severely damaged by atherosclerosis. It has been conjectured that Stalin was murdered. Beria had been suspected of murdering, but no firm evidence has ever appeared. According to a report published in the New York Times, Stalin was poisoned with warfarin by his own Politburo members.